Chapter 1. A Boy from Texas. George W. Bush was born on July 6, 1946, in New Haven, Connecticut. But soon after, his family moved to Texas. Texas became his home. It was a place of wide-open skies, dusty roads, and big dreams. George was the first child of George H.W. Bush and Barbara Bush. His father came from a wealthy family and worked in the oil business. But young George didn't think much about that. He just wanted to play and explore. George had 5 younger siblings. As the oldest, he was often the leader of their adventures. They laughed, argued, and made memories together. Life in the Bush home was never quiet. The family was close, but they also had high expectations. George's parents believed in hard work and strong values. His mother taught him to be kind and respectful. His father showed him the importance of responsibility. George loved sports. Baseball was his favorite. He spent hours practicing his swing and dreaming of becoming a famous player. He also enjoyed watching games with his father. Those moments were special. But George wasn't just about sports. He loved being outside, climbing trees, riding bikes, and making up games with his friends. He was full of energy and loved to laugh. School, however, was a challenge for George. He wasn't the best student. Reading was hard for him, and he sometimes struggled to focus. His teachers wanted him to try harder. George wanted to do well, but he often felt like he didn't fit in. He wasn't the smartest kid in the room, but he had other qualities. He was friendly, confident, and knew how to make people smile. As a boy, George didn't think much about the future. He lived in the moment, but his family's world was bigger than most. His father was already involved in politics. He became a congressman in 1966. George saw how hard his father worked. He also saw the pressure that came with leadership. At the time, George didn't know if he wanted that kind of life. One summer, when George was 14, he went to a boarding school in Massachusetts. It was called Phillips Academy. It was far from Texas. George felt homesick. The other boys seemed smarter and more serious than him. They came from wealthy families and had big ambitions. George, on the other hand, just wanted to enjoy life. He didn't love studying. His grades were average at best. Sometimes he wondered if he really belonged there. But George didn't give up. He had a talent for connecting with people. He made friends easily and became the kind of person others looked up to. He joined the school's baseball team and worked hard to improve. Even when he wasn't the best, he kept trying. His cheerful attitude and determination helped him through tough times. Back in Texas during the holidays, George felt more like himself. He loved being home with his family. He would ride horses, watch sunsets, and laugh with his siblings. Texas was where he felt free. But as he grew older, he began to wonder about his future. What kind of man would he become? George's father often talked to him about responsibility. "You have to make your own way in life, George," his father said. "Success doesn't come easy." George listened, but he didn't always follow the advice. He liked to have fun, and sometimes got into trouble. His mischievous side was well known in the family. One story about young George became famous. He once put firecrackers in a mailbox just for a laugh. The explosion startled the neighbors. His father was not amused. "You can't behave like this, George," his father said sternly. "Actions have consequences." George felt bad and promised to be more careful. Moments like these taught him important lessons about responsibility. As George grew, his love for Texas only deepened. He admired the strength and independence of the people. Texans were proud, hard-working, and tough. George wanted to be like them. He admired his father's success, but wasn't sure he could follow in his footsteps. George's teenage years were full of ups and downs. He sometimes doubted himself. He didn't always feel smart or talented, but he had a big heart and a sense of humor that made people feel at ease. His ability to connect with others became one of his greatest strengths. By the time George finished high school, he was ready for a new adventure. He decided to go to Yale University, just like his father and grandfather. Yale was far from Texas, but George was excited. He didn't know what the future held, but he was ready to find out. Leaving Texas was bittersweet. George loved the land and the people. But deep down, he knew that he needed to explore the world. As he packed his bags, his mother gave him some advice. "Stay true to yourself, George," she said, "and don't forget where you come from." Looking back, George's childhood shaped the man he would become. His love for Texas gave him strength. His family's values taught him discipline. His struggles in school taught him resilience, and his faith in himself, even when others doubted him, helped him keep moving forward. George didn't know it then, but his journey was just beginning. He would face many challenges in the years to come. Some would test his courage. Others would test his heart. But the boy from Texas would grow into a man who led a nation through some of its darkest days. For now, though, he was just George, a boy with big dreams, a mischievous grin, and a deep love for Texas. Chapter 2. A New Direction. George W. Bush started college in 1964. He went to Yale University in Connecticut, far from his Texas home. Yale was a prestigious school, known for its history and high standards. George's father and grandfather had also studied there. But George wasn't worried about following their footsteps. He just wanted to make friends and enjoy his life. At Yale, George quickly became popular. He had a big smile and a natural charm. People liked being around him. He joined a fraternity, a group of students who held parties and events. George loved the excitement and energy of college life. He made jokes, played pranks, and became the life of the party. However, George struggled with his studies. He didn't enjoy sitting in lectures or reading long books. His grades were low, and his professors were not impressed. George knew he wasn't living up to expectations, but he didn't seem to mind. "I'll figure it out later," he often said. George admired his father, but he was different from him. His father was serious and focused, a man who worked hard and planned every step of his life. George, on the other hand, liked to live in the moment. He believed there was plenty of time to grow up. One summer, George returned to Texas. He worked on an oil rig, a tough and dirty job. The work was hard, but George liked the challenge. He felt proud of himself. He realized how much he loved Texas and its people. But he also knew that he needed more direction in his life. After graduating from Yale in 1968, George faced a big decision. The Vietnam War was happening, and many young men were being drafted to fight. George wanted to serve his country, but he didn't want to go to Vietnam. He decided to join the Texas Air National Guard. The Air National Guard was a reserve force. It allowed George to stay in the U.S. while serving as a pilot. Joining the Guard wasn't easy. George had to pass difficult tests to qualify for flight training. He was nervous but determined. He wanted to prove that he could succeed. Training to become a pilot was tough. George had to learn to fly complicated planes and follow strict rules. He spent long hours studying and practicing in the air. At first, he struggled. The instructors were tough, and George made mistakes. But he didn't give up. He pushed himself harder than ever before. Finally, George earned his wings. He became a certified pilot, flying F-102 fighter jets. He was proud of this achievement. Flying gave him a sense of freedom and confidence. For the first time, George felt like he was in control of his future. But George's time in the Air National Guard was not without challenges. He sometimes skipped training sessions and didn't always follow the rules. This led to questions about his commitment. People began to wonder, was George taking his responsibilities seriously? At the same time, George was struggling with personal issues. He enjoyed drinking and partying more than he should. His carefree lifestyle started to catch up with him. He knew he wasn't making the best choices. One night, George was pulled over by the police for drinking and driving. This was a wake-up call. His parents were disappointed. George felt ashamed. He began to realize that his actions had consequences. Despite these struggles, George continued to learn from his experiences. He started thinking more about what kind of man he wanted to be. He admired the discipline and courage of his fellow pilots. He also saw how hard his father worked in politics and business. Slowly, George began to feel the weight of responsibility. During this time, George also developed a deeper connection to his faith. He had grown up in a religious family, but now he began to reflect more on his beliefs. He started praying and asking himself important questions. What did he want to do with his life? How could he make a difference? In 1973, George left the Air National Guard. He returned to civilian life, but he wasn't sure what to do next. His father encouraged him to go to business school. George agreed, hoping it would give him direction. He enrolled at Harvard Business School in 1973. This was a big step for George. Harvard was one of the top schools in the country. The classes were demanding, and George had to work harder than ever before. He struggled at first, but he didn't give up. George's time at Harvard taught him discipline and focus. He learned how to manage money, make decisions, and work with people. These skills would help him later in life, even though he didn't know it at the time. After graduating from Harvard, George felt more confident. He was ready to start a new chapter. He moved back to Texas, excited to make his mark on the world. Looking back, these years were full of lessons for George W. Bush. He made mistakes, but he also learned from them. He discovered the importance of hard work, responsibility, and faith. These experiences shaped the man he would become. A man who would one day lead a nation through difficult times. Chapter 3. A Change of Heart. George W. Bush had a problem. For many years, he drank too much alcohol. At first, it didn't seem like a big deal. He enjoyed parties and good times with his friends. But over time, drinking started to affect his life. George's friends often laughed at his jokes. He was the fun guy at the party. He made everyone smile. But when the night ended, George felt empty. He knew something wasn't right. His family started to worry. His father, George H.W. Bush, was a man of discipline and respect. He had big hopes for his son. George's mother, Barbara, was loving but firm. She told him, "George, you need to think about your future." George listened, but he didn't always change. He was stubborn. He thought he could handle it. He didn't want to admit that alcohol was becoming a problem. One night in 1976, George made a serious mistake. He was driving home after drinking too much. The police stopped him. George was arrested for driving under the influence. This was a wake-up call. His parents were disappointed. George was embarrassed. After that night, George began to think deeply about his life. He realized he needed to change. But change didn't come quickly. He still went out with friends. He still drank. But the doubts in his mind grew stronger. In 1977, George met a woman named Laura Welch. She was kind, calm, and intelligent. Laura wasn't like the women George had dated before. She was different. She didn't drink much. She loved books and quiet evenings. Laura made George think about the kind of man he wanted to be. George and Laura got married later that year. Their love brought stability to George's life. But even Laura couldn't solve his problem with alcohol. George had to make the decision himself. In 1986, everything changed. George was now 40 years old. He was no longer a young man. He had a family, a career, and responsibilities, but he still drank too much. One morning, after a long night of drinking, George woke up feeling terrible. His head hurt. His heart was heavy. He looked at himself in the mirror and asked, "Is this who I want to be?" The answer was clear. No. George wanted more for his life. He wanted to be a better husband, a better father, and a better person. That day, George made a decision. He stopped drinking. It wasn't easy. At first, he missed the parties and the fun, but he knew he had to stay strong. He leaned on his faith for support. George started to pray more often. He asked God for guidance. his faith became a powerful force in his life. It gave him hope and strength. When he felt weak, he turned to prayer. His family also supported him. Laura encouraged him every step of the way. She was proud of him for making the change. His parents, too, were relieved. They saw a new George, a man who was finally in control of his life. Stopping drinking wasn't just about saying no to alcohol. It was about becoming a new person. George began to focus on the things that really mattered. He spent more time with his family. He worked harder on his career. He started thinking about how he could make a difference in the world. This change of heart didn't happen overnight. It took time. George faced challenges. Some days were harder than others, but he kept going. One day, George shared his story with a friend. He said, "Stopping drinking saved my life." His honesty inspired others. People admired his courage and determination. As George grew stronger, so did his faith. He began to read the Bible more often. He found comfort in its words. His favorite verse became, "To whom much is given, much is required." George believed he had been given many blessings. Now, he wanted to give back. This change in George's life was not just personal. It was also spiritual. He felt a new sense of purpose. He believed God had a plan for him. He didn't know exactly what that plan was, but he trusted it. George's decision to stop drinking changed his relationships too. He became closer to Laura. Their marriage grew stronger. He also became a better father to his twin daughters, Jenna and Barbara. George wanted to set a good example for them. This new direction in George's life gave him the confidence to think bigger. He began to consider a future in politics. His father was a respected leader, and George wanted to follow in his footsteps. In 1989, George's father became the President of the United States. George watched him closely. He saw the hard work, the sacrifices, and the challenges. He also saw the impact one person could have. This inspired George. By the early 1990s, George's life looked completely different. He was sober, focused, and full of energy. He was no longer the carefree young man who drank too much. He was a man with a purpose. Chapter 4. Stepping into Politics. In the early 1990s, George W. Bush's life was changing. He had stopped drinking. He focused on his family and his faith. But something inside him was restless. He wanted to make a difference. He wanted to serve others. George had grown up watching his father in politics. His father, George H.W. Bush, had been a congressman, ambassador, and vice president. In 1989, his father became the President of the United States. George saw the dedication and hard work it took to lead. He admired his father's strength. At the same time, George felt his own calling. He believed he could help people in Texas, his home state. He loved Texas, the land, the people, the spirit. He wanted to give back. But could he win their trust? In 1994, George decided to run for governor of Texas. It was a bold decision. He had never held political office before. His opponent, Ann Richards, was the current governor. She was popular and experienced. Many people thought George didn't stand a chance. George was determined. He started his campaign with energy and focus. He traveled across Texas, visiting big cities and small towns. He spoke to farmers, teachers, business owners, and workers. He listened to their concerns. In his speeches, George talked about hope and change. He promised to improve schools, create jobs, and make Texas a better place to live. His words were simple but powerful. "I believe in Texas," he said. "Together, we can make our state stronger." George's charisma won people over. He wasn't just a politician. He was a Texan like them. He wore cowboy boots and spoke with a Southern accent. He made people feel comfortable. But the campaign wasn't easy. Ann Richards was a strong opponent. She was clever and quick with her words. During debates, she challenged George's experience. She asked, "Why should Texans trust you to lead?" George didn't back down. He stayed calm and confident. He admitted he didn't have as much experience, but he had something else, a vision. He believed in his ideas, and he believed in the people of Texas. The election was intense. The polls were close. George worked harder than ever. He shook hands, gave speeches, and met as many voters as he could. Every day brought new challenges. But George refused to give up. On election night, the results came in. George W. Bush had won. It was a surprising victory. Many people had doubted him, but he proved them wrong. He became the 46th governor of Texas. George's family was proud. His father called to congratulate him. "Well done, son," his father said. George smiled. He knew the real work was just beginning. As governor, George faced big challenges. One of his first goals was to improve education. He wanted every child in Texas to have a good start in life. He worked with teachers, parents, and lawmakers to create new programs. George also focused on the economy. He wanted to bring more jobs to Texas. He met with business leaders and encouraged them to invest in the state. Slowly, things began to improve. But not everyone agreed with George's ideas. Some lawmakers argued with him. Others said his plans were too ambitious. George listened to their concerns, but he stayed true to his beliefs. He learned how to compromise and how to lead. One of George's strengths was his ability to connect with people. He visited schools, factories, and farms. He asked questions and listened carefully. He wanted to understand the struggles of everyday Texans. George's leadership was put to the test during difficult times. In 1998, wildfires swept across parts of Texas. Homes and businesses were destroyed. People were scared and angry. George acted quickly. He organized emergency teams and visited the affected areas. He spoke to families who had lost everything. "We will rebuild," he told them. His words gave people hope. By the end of his first term, George had earned the respect of many Texans. Even those who didn't vote for him admitted he was a strong leader. In 1998, he ran for re-election. This time, his victory was even bigger. During his second term, George began to think about the future. Texas was doing well, but he wanted to do more. He started to consider running for president. It was a big decision. Could he lead the entire country? George talked to his family and close friends. He prayed for guidance. He knew the road ahead would be tough, but he felt ready. His time as governor had prepared him for the challenges of leadership. This chapter of George W. Bush's life shows how determination can lead to success. He faced doubt and criticism, but he didn't give up. He worked hard, listened to others, and stayed focused on his goals. George's journey in politics had just begun. The boy from Texas had proven he could lead. Now, the world was watching to see what he would do next. Chapter 5. The Road to the White House. In 1999, George W. Bush made a big decision. He announced that he would run for President of the United States. It was a bold step. George believed he could lead the country. He had been a successful governor of Texas. Now, he wanted to take on a bigger challenge. Running for president is not easy. It takes time, money, and hard work. George began traveling across the country. He visited small towns, big cities, and everything in between. He shook hands, gave speeches, and listened to people's concerns. In his speeches, George talked about his vision for America. He promised to improve education, lower taxes, and make the government work better. "I want to be a uniter, not a divider," he said. People liked his energy and confidence, but George faced competition. Other politicians wanted to be president too. The first challenge was winning his party's nomination. To do this, George had to prove he was the best choice. His main opponent was John McCain, a respected senator and war hero. The race between George and John McCain was tough. Both men worked hard to win votes. They debated on television, sharing their ideas and plans. McCain had more experience in Washington, but George focused on his record as governor. He said, "I know how to bring people together to get things done." In the end, George won the nomination. He was now the Republican candidate for president. But the real challenge was still ahead. He would face Al Gore, the vice president, in the 2000 election. Al Gore was a strong opponent. He had been in politics for many years. He was well known and respected. George knew this would be a close race. The campaign was intense. George and Al Gore traveled across the country, meeting voters and giving speeches. They debated on television. Millions of Americans watched. Both men wanted to show they were ready to lead. George focused on his message of change. He promised to cut taxes and improve schools. He said, "I believe in the American dream. I want to help every family achieve it." His words inspired hope. Election day came on November 7th, 2000. Millions of people went to vote. George and his family waited anxiously for the results. It was a long night. The votes were very close. At first, it looked like Al Gore had won. Then, it looked like George had won. The results in one state, Florida, were too close to call. Florida's votes would decide the winner. The nation held its breath. People were nervous and confused. News channels showed maps of Florida again and again. It was a tense time for everyone. The votes in Florida were counted and then recounted. Lawyers got involved. There were arguments about which votes should be counted. The process dragged on for weeks. George and his family stayed hopeful. They prayed and waited. The uncertainty was difficult, but George remained calm. He trusted that everything would work out. Finally, on December 12, 2000, the Supreme Court made a decision. They ruled in George's favor. He had won Florida's 25 electoral votes. This gave him enough to become president. The announcement brought relief and celebration. George was now the 43rd President of the United States. But the victory was bittersweet. The country was deeply divided. Many people were happy, but others were upset. In his first speech as president-elect, George spoke about unity. He said, "I will work to earn your trust. I will be a president for all Americans, not just those who voted for me." His words were meant to heal and inspire. The road to the White House had been long and difficult. George faced doubts, challenges, and criticism. But he never gave up. His determination and faith carried him through. On January 20th, 2001, George W. Bush was sworn in as president. He stood on the steps of the U.S. Capitol with his hand on the Bible. His father, George H.W. Bush, watched proudly from the audience. It was a historic moment. A father and son who had both become president. As George took the oath of office, he felt the weight of responsibility. He knew the challenges ahead would be great, but he also felt ready. He believed in his vision for America. George's journey to the presidency was unique. He had started as a young man with no clear direction. Over time, he had found his purpose. Now, he was ready to lead a nation. Before we begin, Chapter 6, a quick note for our listeners. You're currently listening to this audiobook on WooEnglish. Remember, this content is specially made for WooEnglish listeners only. If you're hearing it on any other channel, it may be a violation of WooEnglish's rights. Please ensure you're tuned into the right source to fully enjoy and respect this audiobook journey. Now, let's continue the story. Chapter 6, A Day That Changed the World. September 11th, 2001 began like any other day. George W. Bush woke up early. He was in Florida to visit a school. He planned to talk about education, a topic close to his heart. The sun was shining, and the day seemed peaceful. George arrived at the school and greeted the teachers and students. The children were excited. They had prepared for his visit and were ready to show what they had learned. George smiled as he entered the classroom. He sat down with a group of young students. They opened their books and began to read. George listened closely, encouraging them with kind words. For a moment, everything felt normal. But then, an aide entered the room. He leaned down and whispered in George's ear. "A plane has hit the World Trade Center," the aide said quietly. George froze. He didn't understand at first. Was it an accident? George stayed calm. He nodded, thanked the aide, and continued listening to the children read. His mind, however, was racing. What had happened in New York? Was anyone hurt? Minutes later, the aide returned. He whispered again, "A second plane has hit the other tower. America is under attack." George's heart sank. This was no accident. This was something terrible. George finished the reading session, trying to remain composed. He didn't want to alarm the children, but inside he felt the weight of the moment. He knew this was a crisis unlike anything he had faced before. He left the classroom and entered a small room where his team was waiting. They told him what they knew. 2 planes had crashed into the World Trade Center in New York City. Another had hit the Pentagon in Washington, D.C. A 4th plane was missing. George felt a mix of emotions, shock, sadness, and anger. He thought about the people in the towers, the workers at the Pentagon, and the passengers on the planes. He knew many lives had been lost. As president, George had to act quickly. He needed information. He needed to make decisions. But most importantly, he needed to reassure the American people. He spoke briefly to the press, calling the attacks a national tragedy. He promised that those responsible would be brought to justice. His voice was steady, but his heart was heavy. George boarded Air Force One, the president's plane. It was not safe to return to Washington right away. The plane flew to a secure location while George continued to receive updates. In New York, the scene was horrifying. The twin towers of the World Trade Center had collapsed. Thick smoke filled the air. Firefighters and police officers worked tirelessly to save lives. People were scared. George watched the events unfold on television. He saw the towers fall. He saw the panic in the streets. It was hard to believe this was real. He thought about the families who had lost loved ones. Back on Air Force One, George made calls to world leaders. He thanked them for their support and promised to stand strong. The world was watching America. George knew his response would shape history. Later that day, George returned to Washington, D.C. He went straight to the White House. Security was tight. Everyone was on high alert. George met with his team to discuss the next steps. That evening, George addressed the nation from the Oval Office. His voice was calm but firm. He said, "Today, our way of life came under attack, but we will not be defeated. We will find those responsible, and we will protect our people." Millions of Americans watched the speech. They were scared, but George's words gave them hope. He called for unity, saying, "We are stronger together." In the days that followed, George visited New York City. He stood at Ground Zero, where the towers had fallen. The air was thick with smoke and dust. Rescue workers were still searching for survivors. George climbed onto a pile of rubble to speak to the workers. He used a bullhorn to address the crowd. "I can hear you, yeah," he said. "The rest of the world hears you, and the people who knocked these buildings down will hear from us soon." His words brought cheers from the crowd. They inspired hope and determination. George's visit showed the country that he cared deeply about the victims and their families. But the road ahead was not easy. The attacks had left America in shock. People were grieving. The economy was struggling. George faced immense pressure to keep the nation safe. He worked closely with his team to plan a response. They identified the group responsible for the attacks, Al-Qaeda, led by Osama bin Laden. This group had been training terrorists in Afghanistan. George declared a war on terror. He vowed to fight those who threatened America's safety. His decision to send troops to Afghanistan was met with support from many, but also raised questions. Was this the right path? The events of September 11th changed George W. Bush's presidency. They also changed the world. George faced one of the greatest challenges any leader could face. He had to guide a nation through grief, fear, and uncertainty. Through it all, George relied on his faith. He prayed for strength and wisdom. He leaned on his family and close advisors. He knew the decisions he made would have lasting consequences. September 11th, 2001, was a day of sorrow, but it was also a day of unity. Americans came together to help one another. George saw the resilience of the American people. It gave him hope for the future. Chapter 7. War on Terror. After September 11th, 2001, George W. Bush made a promise. He told the American people he would protect them. He said the attacks must never happen again. His voice was strong and his words were clear. "We will not rest until we bring justice to those responsible," he declared. The attacks had shocked the world. People were scared and angry. They wanted answers. George worked with his team to plan a response. They discovered that Al-Qaeda, a terrorist group, was behind the attacks. The group's leader, Osama bin Laden, was hiding in Afghanistan. George made a difficult decision. He ordered the U.S. military to attack Al-Qaeda and its supporters in Afghanistan. The goal was to destroy the terrorist network and capture bin Laden. On October 7th, 2001, the war in Afghanistan began. The first strikes came from the air. U.S. planes targeted Al-Qaeda training camps and Taliban strongholds. The Taliban, a group that controlled much of Afghanistan, had been helping Al-Qaeda. George called them enemies of freedom. The war was not easy. Afghanistan's mountains and deserts made fighting difficult. But the U.S. military worked with allies to push the Taliban out of power. By December 2001, the Taliban government had fallen. Many Al-Qaeda fighters were captured or killed. George spoke to the nation about the progress. "The American people are safer," he said, but the fight was not over. Osama bin Laden had escaped. He remained a threat. As the war in Afghanistan continued, George turned his attention to another country, Iraq. Iraq's leader, Saddam Hussein, was a dictator. He had been in power for many years. George and his team believed Saddam was hiding dangerous weapons. They called them weapons of mass destruction, WMDs. George warned the world about Saddam. He said Iraq could use these weapons to harm other countries. He also accused Saddam of supporting terrorists. Many Americans agreed with George. They wanted to stop Saddam before it was too late. In March 2003, George made another difficult decision. He ordered the U.S. military to invade Iraq. The goal was to remove Saddam Hussein from power and find the weapons. The war in Iraq had begun. The U.S. military moved quickly. In just a few weeks, they captured Baghdad, Iraq's capital. Saddam Hussein's government collapsed. People cheered in the streets. Soldiers tore down statues of Saddam. It seemed like a victory. But the situation in Iraq became more complicated. The weapons of mass destruction were never found. This led to questions. Had the war been a mistake? Many Americans and people around the world began to doubt George's decision. In Iraq, violence grew worse. Armed groups fought against U.S. soldiers. Bombs exploded in crowded markets. Innocent people were caught in the middle. The country was in chaos. George faced criticism. Some people said the war had made things worse, not better. They asked, was this the right choice? Others supported George. They believed removing Saddam Hussein was necessary. George stayed firm. He believed he had made the right decision. He told the American people, freedom is not easy, but it is worth fighting for. He reminded them of the danger posed by terrorism. Back in Afghanistan, the war also continued. The Taliban began to regroup. They launched attacks against U.S. and allied forces. The fight dragged on for years. Many soldiers lost their lives. George visited wounded soldiers in hospitals. He spoke with their families. He hugged them and thanked them for their sacrifices. These moments were emotional and difficult. During his presidency, George gave many speeches about the wars. He told the American people that the fight was for freedom and safety. He said, "We are standing up to evil. We are protecting the future." Despite his efforts, the wars became more controversial. Some Americans grew tired of the long conflict. Protests were held in cities across the country. People held signs that said, "Bring our troops home." George listened to the criticism, but he stayed focused on his mission. He believed history would judge his actions. He often said, "Time will tell if we were right." In 2006, the violence in Iraq reached a peak. George decided to send more troops. This was called the Surge. The goal was to stabilize the country and reduce violence. The surge helped, but the cost was high. More lives were lost. By the end of George's presidency in 2009, the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq were still ongoing. The Taliban remained a threat. Iraq was still rebuilding. George knew the battles were far from over. Looking back, the war on terror defined George's presidency. He faced some of the hardest decisions a leader could make. He had to balance the safety of his country with the cost of war. For many, George's actions were controversial. Some admired his strength and determination. Others criticized his choices, but no one could deny the impact of his leadership during these challenging times. Chapter 8. A Nation Divided. The wars in Afghanistan and Iraq continued for years. Soldiers fought bravely on distant battlefields. Many gave their lives. Families back home waited anxiously for news. For some, the wait ended with tears and heartbreak. For others, it ended with relief and gratitude. At first, many Americans supported the wars. They believed the fight was necessary to protect the country. George W. Bush promised to keep the nation safe. His speeches gave people hope. "We will not falter, and we will not fail," he said. But as time passed, opinions began to change. The wars were taking longer than anyone expected. The costs were rising: money, lives, and trust. People started asking hard questions. Why were the wars still going on? Why had weapons of mass destruction not been found in Iraq? Were the decisions to invade the right ones? Some Americans began to doubt George's leadership. Protests grew louder. People marched in the streets, holding signs and chanting for peace. They wanted the troops to come home. The news showed images of rallies across the country. The voices of opposition could not be ignored. In Washington, George faced criticism from lawmakers. Some said the wars were a mistake. Others supported him but urged him to find solutions faster. The debates were heated. George listened carefully but remained firm in his beliefs. He believed the wars were necessary to stop terrorism and protect freedom. He often said, "History will judge us, but I will not waver in doing what I think is right." Still, the criticism was hard to bear. George cared deeply about the troops and their families. He met with soldiers and visited hospitals to see the wounded. He hugged them, thanked them, and promised their sacrifices were not in vain. One of George's visits to a military hospital was especially emotional. A young soldier who had lost both legs said, "Mr. President, I'd do it all again for my country." George was moved to tears. Moments like these reminded him of the cost of war. At the same time, George faced challenges at home. The country was divided. Some Americans supported his leadership. Others felt the wars had made things worse. Families argued. Friends disagreed. The economy also began to struggle. Jobs were lost, and businesses closed. For many Americans, life became harder. They looked to the president for answers. George tried to bring the nation together. He gave speeches calling for unity. He said, "We are all Americans. We must work together to build a better future." But his words didn't always reach everyone. The media played a big role in shaping opinions. News channels and newspapers reported every decision, every mistake, and every challenge. Some reports were supportive, while others were critical. Americans watched and read, forming their own opinions. George also faced challenges within his own party. Some Republicans wanted him to change his strategies. Others believed he was doing the right thing. The disagreements made his job even harder. One of the most difficult moments came in 2005, when Hurricane Katrina struck the Gulf Coast. The storm caused massive destruction, especially in New Orleans. Thousands of people lost their homes. Many lost their lives. The government's response was slow and chaotic. People were angry. They felt abandoned. George visited the disaster area to offer support, but many blamed him for the failures. "You should have done more," they said. George felt the weight of the criticism. He admitted mistakes had been made. He worked to improve the response and help those affected, but the damage to his reputation was already done. Despite these challenges, George continued to focus on his goals. He believed his actions would make the country safer in the long run. he also worked to strengthen relationships with other nations. He wanted America to be a leader in the world. George found strength in his faith. He prayed for guidance and leaned on his family for support. Laura, his wife, often reminded him to stay hopeful. "You're doing your best," she said. "That's all you can do." The divisions in the country were not easy to heal. People held strong opinions, and the wars remained controversial. George often said, "Leadership is not about being popular. It's about doing what's right." As his presidency continued, George faced new challenges, but he never stopped working. He believed in his mission to protect America and promote freedom. Even when the country seemed divided, he held on to hope. This chapter in George W. Bush's life shows the difficulty of leadership. It reminds us that decisions are not always clear or easy. Leaders must carry the weight of their choices and face the criticism that comes with them. Through it all, George's determination never wavered. He stayed true to his values and continued to lead during one of the most challenging times in American history. Chapter 9. Leading with Faith. George W. Bush faced many challenges as president. The weight of his decisions was heavy. Wars raged in Afghanistan and Iraq. The economy struggled. People criticized him. Through it all, George leaned on his faith. Faith had always been a part of George's life. He grew up in a religious family. His mother taught him Bible stories, and his father showed him the importance of prayer. But as a young man, George did not always follow these lessons. It wasn't until his struggles with alcohol that George's faith deepened. When he decided to stop drinking, he turned to God for strength. He began to pray every day. He read the Bible and found peace in its words. As president, George's faith became even more important. Every morning he spent time in prayer. He asked God for wisdom and courage. "I cannot do this alone," he often said. "I need God's help." During times of crisis, George felt his faith grow stronger. After the attacks of September 11, 2001, he prayed for the victims and their families. He asked God to guide him as he made difficult decisions. George also surrounded himself with people of faith. He met regularly with spiritual advisors. These men and women offered prayers, support, and advice. George valued their guidance. But faith did not make George's life easy. There were moments of doubt and fear. When the wars dragged on, he questioned if he was doing the right thing. He wondered if his decisions were truly guided by God. One night, George sat alone in the White House. The weight of the presidency felt unbearable. He opened his Bible and read a passage from the book of Psalms. It said, "The Lord is my shepherd. I shall not want." These words comforted him. Faith also shaped George's vision for the country. He believed in the power of freedom. He believed all people were created equal in God's eyes. This belief drove many of his decisions. In 2003, George launched a program called PEPFAR. It was designed to fight HIV/AIDS in Africa. The disease was killing millions of people. George felt a moral responsibility to help. "Every life is precious," he said. "We must act." The program saved countless lives. Leaders around the world praised George for his efforts. Even some of his critics called it one of his greatest achievements. Faith also helped George connect with ordinary Americans. He often spoke about his belief in God. He shared personal stories about how prayer had guided him. For many people, these words were inspiring. However, not everyone agreed with George's approach. Some felt he mixed religion and politics too much. Others questioned if his faith influenced his decisions too strongly. These debates added to the challenges he faced. George listened to the criticism, but he stayed true to his beliefs. "I am who I am," he said. "I cannot lead without my faith." One of George's most public moments of faith came after Hurricane Katrina. The storm devastated the Gulf Coast, destroying homes and taking lives. George visited New Orleans to see the damage firsthand. He met with families who had lost everything. He prayed with them, offering words of hope. "God is with you," he said. "We will rebuild together." His words brought comfort to some, though others felt the government's response had been too slow. George's faith was not only personal, it was also practical. He believed faith-based organizations could help solve problems. He created initiatives to support churches, charities, and community groups. These programs helped people in need, from the homeless to the hungry. Through all his efforts, George faced many moments of doubt. He knew that leadership required tough decisions. He prayed for guidance, but understood that answers didn't always come easily. One night, during the height of the Iraq War, George wrote in his journal. He confessed his fears and asked for strength. "I do not know what the future holds," he wrote, "but I trust God to guide me." George's faith also influenced his family life. He prayed with his wife, Laura, and their daughters, Jenna and Barbara. He wanted them to understand the importance of faith. He believed it would give them strength in their own lives. As president, George often quoted the Bible in his speeches. He used scripture to inspire hope and unity. After the attacks of 9/11, he said, "The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it." These words gave people strength during a dark time. But George's faith was not about words alone. It was about actions. He believed faith should lead to kindness, generosity, and service. He encouraged others to live with purpose and compassion. Looking back, George often said that faith was his anchor. It kept him steady when the storms of life raged around him. It gave him courage to face criticism and strength to make hard choices. George's story shows that faith can be a powerful source of hope. It reminds us that even in the hardest times, we are not alone. Chapter 10. Hurricane Katrina. In August 2005, a powerful storm formed in the Atlantic Ocean. It was called Hurricane Katrina. Weather experts warned it could be dangerous. The storm grew stronger as it moved toward the Gulf of Mexico. People watched nervously, hoping it would weaken. But it did not. On August 29th, Katrina struck the Gulf Coast. The damage was devastating. New Orleans, Louisiana, was hit the hardest. The city was below sea level and protected by levees. These levees were built to keep water out, but Katrina was too strong. The levees broke. Water poured into New Orleans. Streets turned into rivers. Homes were flooded. People climbed onto rooftops to escape. Many were trapped without food or water. It was a disaster unlike anything America had seen in years. George W. Bush was at his ranch in Texas when Katrina made landfall. He was briefed about the storm and its destruction. The news was grim. Thousands of people were in danger. The city needed help, and fast. At first, the response was slow. Local and state governments struggled to handle the crisis. Emergency teams were overwhelmed. People were stranded in their homes or shelters. The Superdome, a large stadium in New Orleans, became a refuge for many. But conditions inside were terrible. The federal government was expected to step in. FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, was in charge of disaster relief. But FEMA was unprepared for a disaster of this size. Supplies were delayed. Rescue efforts were disorganized. As days passed, frustration grew. People begged for help on live television. They held signs that said, "We need water," and "Save us." The images were heartbreaking. The whole country was watching and waiting. George visited the area to see the damage. He flew over New Orleans in Air Force One. From the sky, he could see the flooded streets and destroyed homes. The view was shocking. But the visit didn't go as planned. Many people felt George was too distant. They wanted him on the ground, talking to survivors. They wanted action, not just words. Criticism of the government's response grew louder. People asked, why did it take so long to help? Some blamed local officials. Others blamed FEMA. Many blamed George. George admitted mistakes were made. He said, the federal government did not fully understand the size of the problem. He promised to improve the response. He sent more resources to the region. But the damage was already done. Both the physical destruction and the public's trust had been shaken. For many, the slow response to Katrina became a symbol of government failure. Despite the challenges, recovery efforts continued. Volunteers from across the country came to help. They brought food, water, and supplies. Organizations like the Red Cross worked tirelessly to support survivors. George visited New Orleans again, this time meeting with families who had lost everything. He hugged them, listened to their stories, and promised to help rebuild. These moments were emotional and heartfelt. One of the hardest parts of Katrina was the loss of life. More than 1,800 people died. Many were elderly or disabled, unable to escape the rising water. George felt the weight of their loss. He knew the government had to do better in the future. Rebuilding New Orleans was a long and difficult process. Homes, schools, and businesses had to be repaired or replaced. Some people chose to leave the city and never return. Others stayed, determined to rebuild their lives. George worked to provide funding for recovery efforts. Billions of dollars were spent to repair levees, support families, and restart businesses. But the process was slow. Many people felt forgotten. For George, Hurricane Katrina was one of the most difficult moments of his presidency. He faced anger, disappointment, and criticism. He often reflected on what could have been done differently. Looking back, George said, "Katrina taught us important lessons. We must be better prepared for disasters. We must act faster." He hoped future leaders would learn from these mistakes. Hurricane Katrina was a tragedy that tested the nation. It showed the strength of communities, the kindness of strangers, and the resilience of survivors. But it also revealed weaknesses in leadership and planning. For George, it was a time of reflection. He realized that even the best intentions are not enough. Actions matter most. Chapter 11. The Last Years in Office. By 2007, George W. Bush's presidency was nearing its end. He had been in office for almost 2 terms. The world had changed a lot during his time as president. George had faced wars, natural disasters, and economic troubles. Some people admired his leadership, but others questioned his decisions. The wars in Afghanistan and Iraq were still ongoing. In Afghanistan, the Taliban had regained strength. U.S. troops worked hard to fight them, but the conflict seemed endless. Many soldiers were tired, and their families waited anxiously for them to come home. In Iraq, violence continued. Bombings and attacks happened almost daily. The war had become very unpopular in America. Many people felt it had lasted too long. They wanted answers. "When will the troops return?" they asked. George made a bold decision in 2007. He ordered more troops to Iraq in what was called a surge. The goal was to reduce violence and stabilize the country. The surge worked in some areas, but the war was far from over. Critics said it was too little, too late. At home, the economy was in trouble. In 2008, a financial crisis began. Banks failed, and businesses closed. Many people lost their jobs. Families struggled to pay their bills. It was one of the worst economic downturns in U.S. history. George and his team acted quickly. They created a plan to rescue the economy. The government gave money to struggling banks to prevent a collapse. This was called a bailout. Some people supported the plan, but others were angry. They felt the government was helping big banks instead of ordinary people. George felt the pressure. He knew Americans were frustrated. He often said, "I am doing my best to protect this country." But his approval ratings fell. Many people doubted his leadership. Despite the challenges, George stayed focused on his work. He continued to meet with world leaders. He believed strong relationships with other countries were important for peace and security. One of George's proudest achievements during his last years in office was his work in Africa. He created programs to fight disease, especially HIV/AIDS and malaria. These programs saved millions of lives. Many world leaders praised his efforts. George also focused on education. He had introduced a program called No Child Left Behind early in his presidency. The goal was to improve schools and help students succeed. By the end of his presidency, the program had mixed results. Some schools showed progress, but others struggled to meet the standards. As his time in office came to a close, George thought about his legacy. He wondered how people would remember him. Would they focus on the wars and the financial crisis? Or would they see the good he had tried to do? George gave his final State of the Union address in January 2008. He spoke about the challenges the country faced. He urged Americans to stay strong and united. "Our best days are still ahead," he said. The 2008 presidential election was historic. Barack Obama, the first African-American candidate from a major party, won the race. George met with Obama at the White House to ensure a smooth transition. He wanted the new president to succeed. On January 20th, 2009, George left the White House. He and Laura returned to Texas, where they looked forward to a quieter life. George reflected on his years as president. He admitted he had made mistakes, but said he had always tried to do what he thought was right. For George, leaving office was bittersweet. He was proud of his efforts, but knew not everyone agreed with him. He said, "History will judge my presidency. My job was to lead, not to seek popularity." Back in Texas, George began a new chapter. He focused on helping others. He started a foundation to support veterans and fight disease in Africa. He also began painting, finding peace in art. Looking back, George's last years in office were some of the toughest. The wars and the economy tested his leadership. He faced criticism and doubt, but he stayed true to his values and worked hard to serve his country. Chapter 12. Legacy of Leadership. When George W. Bush left the White House in 2009, his life changed completely. He was no longer president. His days were quieter, and the pressures of leadership were behind him. But George wasn't ready to stop making a difference. He wanted to help others and reflect on his time in office. George and Laura moved back to Texas. They settled in Dallas, where they began a new chapter. George started the George W. Bush Presidential Center. It included a library, museum, and institute focused on leadership and global issues. He wanted the center to inspire others to serve and lead. One of George's biggest passions after leaving office was helping veterans. He had seen the sacrifices made by soldiers during his presidency. Many had returned home with injuries, both physical and emotional. George felt a deep responsibility to support them. He started the Bush Institute's Military Service Initiative. This program helped veterans adjust to life after war. It provided job training, health care, and mental health support. George spent time meeting with veterans, listening to their stories, and thanking them for their service. One event George organized was a 100-kilometer mountain bike ride for wounded veterans. He joined the riders, pedaling alongside them through tough terrain. It was challenging, but George loved connecting with the veterans. He admired their courage and determination. Another way George found purpose was through art. He began painting as a hobby. At first, it was just for fun, but over time, it became a passion. George painted portraits of world leaders, friends, and family. He also painted soldiers and veterans. In 2017, George published a book called Portraits of Courage. It featured his paintings of veterans and their stories. He donated the profits to programs that helped them. The book touched many people and showed a different side of George. George also reflected on his time as president. He wrote a memoir called Decision Points. In the book, he shared his thoughts about the major events of his presidency. He admitted to making mistakes, but explained why he made the decisions he did. Critics and historians continued to debate his legacy. Some focused on the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. Others highlighted his work on education, healthcare in Africa, and disaster relief. George listened to the discussions, but did not try to defend himself. He often said, "History will be the judge." George's faith remained an important part of his life. He continued to pray and read the Bible. His faith gave him strength and guided his actions. He believed in treating others with kindness and respect. In his personal life, George enjoyed spending time with his family. He loved being a grandfather to his daughter's children. He often joked that being a grandparent was the best job he ever had. George also stayed connected to his friends and former colleagues. He and Laura traveled to events, gave speeches, and supported causes they cared about. George remained close to other former presidents, including Bill Clinton and Barack Obama. One emotional moment came in 2018 when George's father, George H.W. Bush, passed away. George delivered a heartfelt eulogy at the funeral. He called his father a man of the highest character and thanked him for his example. The speech moved many people to tears. Despite stepping out of the spotlight, George's influence continued. He believed in promoting freedom and democracy around the world. He worked with global leaders to support these values. In Texas, George often returned to his ranch in Crawford. He enjoyed clearing brush, riding horses, and spending time outdoors. The ranch gave him peace and a connection to the land he loved. As the years went on, George's perspective on leadership remained the same. He believed leaders should make decisions based on what they think is right, not what is popular. Leadership is about service, he said. It's about putting others first. George's journey from a young boy in Texas to the 43rd President of the United States was remarkable. His presidency was filled with challenges, from the September 11th attacks to Hurricane Katrina and the financial crisis. Through it all, George stayed true to his beliefs and worked hard to serve his country. Today, George W. Bush is remembered for his resilience, faith, and dedication. His story inspires people to lead with courage and integrity, even in the face of criticism and doubt.